Well, yesterday we left off with Paul's comment in verse 11 where he said, I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I've learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. And as I pointed out yesterday, the word that's translated content here in our English version really had its root in an ancient Greek philosophy which taught that the way to be happy in life was to divest yourself of any kind of emotional or physical or mental need. In other words, you learn to deny hunger, you learn to deny the need for relationships or love. Basically, you become what they called Stoic. It was a Stoic philosophy. Fascinatingly, the Emperor Augustus, the greatest of the Roman emperors, was in fact a proponent of this particular philosophy. He was a Stoic, and he was pretty non-emotional. And I would say that oftentimes in a healthy way, his own daughter became really uncontrollable throughout most of her life because she was yearning for love and approval. I think that on one hand she was trying to get her father's attention, and when she couldn't get her father's attention, she found herself going from one lover after another, hoping that somehow that hole in her heart would be filled, that father hunger that she had. So when Paul says, I've learned to be content, he's not saying that I've learned to not recognize my emotions or my feelings. In fact, if you want to be healthy, you have to find people with whom you can talk honestly and you can share your heart. That you can say, I'm really lonely, or I'm hurting right now, or I'm depressed. Because just being able to share those feelings, to get them out from the inside and outward, is in itself very cathartic and oftentimes healing. I found that many times all I needed was to be able to share what I was thinking or feeling with somebody so that I could feel better. Just to get it outside of myself. Particularly if that person looks at it and says, I hear you, I understand, and my heart breaks for you, and asks if there's anything they can do to help. And most of the time, there's not a lot that people can do to fix situations that we find that overtake us in life. But it's just really, really comforting to know that we're not alone. I remember in the great movie about C.S. Lewis called Shadowlands, where Lewis is talking to one of his graduate students who is seeking to become an author. And Lewis asks the young man the question. He says, why do you want to write? And he said, because when I write, I don't feel alone. In other words, if somebody would read what I wrote and understand and appreciate it and value it, then I realize that my life has a connection outside of my own head. And that really underscores, I think, what every one of us feels. I mean, it really lies at the root of our religious faith because, we all look at the heavens and wonder, is there somebody out there? I was relating to somebody about before I was saved, and I was going to University of California, Berkeley, and I was wandering around 2 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't sleep. I was tormented. I remember going in the middle of Berkeley High School football field, which was about 2 miles from my apartment, and I just started screaming at God, saying, if you're there, show yourself to me, and so forth and so on. And I carried on for a while, and finally, it's like nothing happened. I got no voices back, and I turned around and just started walking back to my apartment. And as I'm walking along, suddenly I hear this voice in my head that says, if you don't believe I'm there, who are you yelling at? And at that moment, it was not only surprising, but it was shocking because I knew that this thought had not originated in my brain. It had come from someplace outside of me, and that I was not alone, and that God did hear, and he was there. And that was the beginning of a tremendous transformational moment in my life that ended up leading me into the faith of Christ because I realized that there was a God and that this God was listening to me. He cared about me and that I could speak to him and he would speak back to me. Now, most of the time, God doesn't speak to me like that. He usually speaks to me through his word. He speaks to me a lot of times through these kind of mediums. I find sometimes I'm listening to messages or reading different articles or reading different theological books. And I think it strikes me that God really powerfully impacts me in that moment as I'm reading this information, that I see somebody else sees what I see or feels something that I feel or has been able to explain something that I have not been able to understand. And that connection is powerful and it's vital. But it needs to go deeper than just God himself. I mean, certainly Paul could say, I'm going to be sustained by God if nobody comes near me. But there's something so wonderful when we find that warmth of companionship. My wife and I tomorrow will be celebrating our 52nd wedding anniversary. When you think about it, we got married when we were 20. And so it's like we've been living together 2.5 times longer than we even were alive before we got married. And our lives are so intertwined with each other, interwoven with each other. I mean, quite honestly, our biggest question mark now is what happens if we live long enough and one of us passes away? And, I worry about how will my wife be taken care of and all those kinds of things. But what really is the heaviest part, and I see that with my family, my parents, my mom and my father-in-law, losing their spouses, there's a tremendous sense of the absence of the other, that the other person becomes kind of like an echo to everything you do and say, and suddenly it's like speaking into a void and nothing comes back. You just realize that there is nobody that's reflecting what I'm feeling and what I'm seeing. And that's why we find that a lot of people end up dying. In fact, it's quite well known that many people die simply because of loneliness. I don't remember if I talked about this early in the week, but they certainly found that true to be with the slave trades when they were bringing African slaves to the Americas, not just the United States, but all of the Americas. And many of those men and women died in transit. They just simply decided to give up on life. They just stopped wanting to live. And that's a powerful force on the inside of us. And so when we begin to minimize the impact of loneliness, we're making a very foolish mistake. Now, if you're a person who is very gregarious, very social, usually if you're younger, you're interacting with a lot of people, it's hard to understand how people could feel lonely. But increasingly the number is going up, especially amongst younger people who have lost the ability to interact effectively with others because their whole world of interaction is digitally done. It's done through media. And they really feel terribly disconnected. So what Paul goes on to say is that, as I read last week, he says, I'm not saying this because I have some need, but he says, I know what it is to be in need. And we might say, to be lonely. He says, I know what that feels like. And I know what it is to have plenty, to be surrounded with loving people who care for you. And he says, I've learned the secret of being content in every and any situation, whether I'm fed or hungry, whether I'm living in plenty or I'm living in want, because I can do everything through him who gives me strength. Now, the question we might have at this point is, how does that give a person strength? And the answer is this, that I realize that what's happening in my life is the result of going on a journey with somebody else. The Christian life is following Jesus. And if we follow Jesus, we're going to find times where we have plenty and we're going to find times where we'll be in need. We're going to find times where we're going to be lonely, and sometimes we're going to find ourselves overwhelmed by the abundance of people that want to talk to us. And we have all of those experiences, and yet the one thing that becomes the consistent stabilizer is the fact that I am not actually and truly alone. He says, your rod and your staff, Psalm 23 says, they comfort me. Even when I'm walking through the valley of shadow of death, I know you are with me. And that sense is something that, just because you know Psalm 23 doesn't make you feel comforted. But if you know the true author, the divine author of Psalm 23, and you know that he's saying that to you, which was my experience when I started reading the Bible as a young Christian, that you realize I am not alone, that God hears me, God is speaking to me, God is journeying with me, God cares about me in every single moment of my life. And that's, I think, what becomes really, really critical. The key to building meaningful relationships with other people ultimately is by first building a deeper relationship with God. And as we go deeper in the Lord, we learn how to be better friends, better husbands, wives, mothers, fathers, children. God, our Father, teaches us how to be in relationship with Him. And that's why as we learn how to be in relationship with God, we actually become better at walking in relationship with other people. God speaks into our lives in very powerful ways, and many of them are designed to help us have more vital and meaningful connections with other people. Well, got one more to go this week, and so hang on, and I'll be back with you tomorrow. Many blessings.